what did you learn about the data that you didn't know before you were kind of executing this response?
The crown jewels were far more spread out than originally thought. And that really impacts resilience and your ability to continue operations or to bounce back from your downtime.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Strive. I'm Gareth Russell, Security Field CTO for Commvault in Asia Pacific. And today I'm joined by Kayla Williams, who is a seasoned global cybersecurity leader and risk expert with over 15 years of experience driving governance, risk, and security strategy for high-impact organizations. But more importantly, helping bridge the gap between technical teams and executive leadership. We're going to keep today's session grounded in real insights, what actually happens under pressure, how governance shows up in decisions, and how resilience spans cyber and the new AI. All right, welcome, Kayla. Welcome to Strive, and also welcome to Australia. Great to have you here today.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to be here.
All right, can I start with a hard question? Is that okay?
Yes, of course.
All right. Can you think of a real incident you've lived through, and what was the first sign that something was off or something didn't quite feel right?
It wasn't this alert storm that we've all come to expect of a major incident. It was actually just a small blip, an anomaly that no one was really paying too close attention to because it wasn't setting off those alarms, but it was an after hours privilege access escalation that caught our attention.
And so when you think back to that process, what worked as you were kind of going through that blip? What was it? Was it something that governance got right? Or how did that feel as you were kind of trying to understand what went right and what went wrong?
The what went right piece, I think, was really easy. We had predefined plans in place. So everyone knew their role and they knew their decision-making capabilities and the escalation paths. So that was probably what made it less disruptive for not only my team, the security operations team, but also the stakeholders that we had to interact with. I think on the bad side, if you want to call it the bad side, was really around the lackadaisical approach that some of our peers were having to it. There's like, oh, it's not a big deal. So-and-so has this access, maybe they're just working late.
Yep.
And that did have an impact on how quickly we were able to respond.
And so when the incident hit and you had your plans available and you're kind of working through that process, was that something that your teams had rehearsed for? Is that something that you felt comfortable in that moment being able to start that incident response process and get things going from there?
Yeah, absolutely. We do tabletop exercises. We were doing purple teaming.
Right.
We were a FedRAMP authorized organization. So what that means is the United States government put us through their programs so that we could sell into federal agencies. So we had very strict requirements in that space. And because we had been practicing, we had been audited to death, we were very comfortable with executing according to that plan.
And so when that muscle memory kicked in, what was the evidence that people were looking for? Were you trying to find that indicator of compromise? Were you trying to find what it was that impacting your data? What were you kind of looking for as that kind of progressed and unfolded?
We started with, I think what everyone starts with is your identity logs, your access logs, making sure that there isn't any abnormal lateral movement through the environment. I think what really became clear to us at the time was that we didn't quite understand the data lineage paths. So we had our authorized boundary diagrams, we had data flows, but they weren't to the level that we had really required at that point in time. We didn't understand, the backwards and the forwards directionality of the data, and of course, third party as well. So we were looking for a lot of different types of indications of compromise and that lateral movement amongst various different teams within the different tiers of our SOC.
And what was it like kind of bringing all of those teams together? Because there's a lot of technical components, like technology elements that go into all of that analysis. Where did the humans come together in that process to kind of drive that outcome?
That is such a great question because it's really important to make sure that your teams have their decision authority. They understand where they can make decisions. But it's also really important that people trust each other and getting that cross collaboration amongst teams. I don't think it's a secret, right? That security teams and engineers don't necessarily always see eye to eye.
There's so much friction in that process.
There really is. But if you can keep that and make it to the common goal is figuring out what's going on and helping the organization and approaching it in a delicate manner and not being like, I know better than you on both sides makes it a lot easier to get things accomplished. You can argue about approach when you do your postmortem, but at the time, I think it's really important to know who can make decisions, when you can make those decisions, and then working together collaboratively.
And so as you had all that navigation, bridging the gap between like your security teams and your IT operations teams, what was the behavior that surprised you the most? Was it good? Was it bad? Was it just, we're on this mission, we have this goal in sight? Like, was there any of those kind of like behavioral things that were interesting as a reflection going through this incident?
Yeah, I would say on both sides of the aisle, if you want to call it that, the engineering side and the security side, all of the analysts knew their stuff. And I think that's really important that they were confident and they felt, I don't want to say they were in a safe space, but that they could make decisions at that certain level to go ahead and follow the breadcrumbs and to investigate certain ways and to reach across the aisle and say, hey, I found this, but can you use your access to look into this? Because they understood the gravity of the situation. I think the bad side, the behaviors of some of the executives, my peers who downplayed the severity, who were, disappointed that something happened, because it always happens on a Friday night,
sure,
right? No matter where you are in the world, it's always a Friday night that it happens. So wanted to put things off a bit. It was a little bit disappointing, and it was part of the postmortem discussions, of course. But overall, I think everyone understands when they're in an incident that they need to step up and step forward. And I was very impressed with those analysts that were in the front lines.
If I take the next part of kind of following that trail on the incident, data always shows up as you're kind of running through the analysis, the investigation, the recovery, the postmortem, all those lessons learned. What did you learn about the data that you didn't know before you were kind of executing this response?
The crown jewels were far more spread out than originally thought. And that really impacts resilience and your ability to continue operations or to bounce back from your downtime. So the data lineage piece, as I mentioned before, and really truly understanding at that granular level what it's doing and where it's going is extremely important. So that was a big part of our takeaway, was to do a better job at that.
Did that change the way you thought about classifying the data moving forward or trying to figure out the right place to store it? Were you able to put something in place to kind of work through that in terms of what that meant for more strategic decisions?
Absolutely. And this was pre the DSPM kind of uptick that you're seeing these days. So it was manual at the time, but we decided to have more types of data classification categories. So instead of just being restricted, confidential, internal, we took it a step further and we said client data dash, government.
Right.
Because you then know, okay, this cannot leave the US versus client data dash EU or APAC, and understanding where that data could or couldn't go. And you find things like leakage in places, or spillage, I should say. I shouldn't say leakage, but spillage over in places. And you go, oh, whoops, microservices are doing something we didn't know they were doing.
Yeah.
And that becomes, I wouldn't say code red, but does become a problem when you start to look at contractual requirements that you have with your clients around those things. So then it does become all hands on deck.
Yeah, particularly when you look to see where the globe is going around the compliance and the legislation and all of these kind of regulations that are driving some of the sovereign discussions or, data being kept in this particular case, but at least knowing where it is and what you need to do with it. I think it's an important part of learning from some of these incidents as well. So resilience is the goal. The board's asking for it. Our regulators are asking for it. Compliance is kind of uplifting it. If you were to think about the intersection of governance, what's the one decision that matters most? Is it ownership? Is it funding? Or is it prioritization? What does that look like?
It's ownership. I think with anything, when you start to talk about governance, you have to have an executive that owns the process. So resilience, you need an owner. AI, you need an owner. Security, you need an owner, right? So having someone who is defined as accountable for a resilience process, the money will come after, right? The road mapping comes after, but having a single person that you can point to, and I don't want to say a throat to choke. I think that's such a terrible thing to say, but it's kind of true, right?
Yeah.
Who's held accountable to making sure that all of these intersecting processes that do impact your resilience work together cohesively is really important.
Okay, so your organization, you've made that decision. Ownership is, making sure we've got the accountability as part of that process. You're that person. What does measurement look like for resilience? What does performance look like for resilience? Where does this person start trying to kind of navigate, trying to put these pieces together? Because I know my budget's going to come. I know my roadmap's going to come. I've got to put this strategy together. But where do they start in trying to make sure that they can measure and they're on the right course? It's kind of heading to that true north. What does that look like for that person?
Boring. I will be very honest. It's going to start boring. And that is the administrative side.
Yeah.
You have to sit, not this person individually, but their teams have to sit with the business and really truly understand what that business is trying to accomplish. And going back to like the data flows, what kind of data do they have? What third parties do they have? What systems do they have? What is like the crown jewels to them? Then you go and sit with the next one and you look and, okay, so sales has all these processes, and they talk to customer success this way, who talks to engineering this way. You kind of follow, and then you can really understand what's critical to the business. So it is kind of that business continuity, administrative GRC, enterprise risk management type work. So the boring stuff, I'll be honest, like I came up, it's extremely boring, but it's crucial. It's absolutely crucial.
Very crucial. Very crucial.
And then people tend to focus on KPIs, right? The performance indicators. I come from a space where we focus on the risk indicators, the KRIs. So think of the inverse of a KPI. It's the indication that something has gone from green to amber to red within your own risk tolerance. So saying that we've had 10 knocks at the door this week in terms of our security operations center. We've stopped 10 people from coming in. Okay, that's great. That's a wonderful KPI. But how many got really close to getting through? What does that look like? And if you have 3, is that acceptable? So what can you put in place to reduce that? And I really think that understanding what their risk appetite is and being able to say that's unacceptable, we have to, patch this this process will then help, kind of stymie any further issues that you have down the line.
If you were to kind of put together those capabilities around defining some of these performance metrics, defining some of these data assets and your crown jewels and things like that, what's the next part of that definition that organizations that want to get and kind of level up their resilience should be looking for?
That's a really good question. I would say if you want to like level up your resilience, you don't need to be looking at, your mean time to detect and things like that necessarily, unless it's really bad and you need to, like if you have an MSSP and they're not detecting things, that's a separate issue.
Yeah.
That is more a vendor risk issue than anything else. But I would say the ability to track where the movement is going to go. So understanding your data flows, that data lineage, is if a bad guy gets in and there's nothing that stops them from, moving through your environment, like you should know where they're going to go next, anticipate it, have honeypots there, whatever it might be, and understanding what's effective in stopping it. So have, a purple team exercise, have a red team exercise, see where those gaps are and address those technical controls. Because at that point, if they're in, it's a technical control that's failing somewhere or is missing. So looking at the metrics around how many of those controls have failed is going to be far more effective than how many knocks are there at the door and, how many people have finished their security training on time.
Sure.
That doesn't really matter at that point. So it's really testing those controls repeatedly is going to be your indicator that you're going to be able to be resilient.
All right, Kayla, to close this out. So we talked about resilience. We talked about indicators, KRIs, the culture, the human aspect of things, the governance that needs to sit all around that. Governance is not so much very boring. I still think it's incredibly important. But if you had the crystal ball or your bingo card for 2026, what are the top things that governance teams should stop doing, should start doing, and they should continue to keep doing?
I would say stop with the excuses of not going for AI.
Okay.
I know it sounds really harsh, but a lot of the folks that I've talked to across various different industry verticals from a GRC security team perspective are like, oh, well, it's too big. We can't deal with it. Engineering's got it over there. And we have a policy check. Build AI controls and AI processes into your already existing risk platforms. Get a control library in place. Really understand the space. And then you stop being the no and become the, oh, no problem. We understand it already and let's work through it together. I think that's the only way to success.
Yeah. Reduce that friction, be
Absolutely.
the enabler as part of that process.
Yeah, don't be afraid of the unknown.
Yeah.
I think is really the more appropriate way to put that.
You already have so many known unknowns in the environment that you're trying to deal with already. Right. Don't be afraid of it, right? Perfect. Kayla, thank you so much for your time today, for sharing your perspective, for sharing those lessons, for talking through a bit of the incident. I really do appreciate the chance to kind of learn from leaders that have navigated some of these incidents. You've designed all this governance, you've built all this resilience firsthand. So thank you very much. To our listeners, thank you for being here. You can catch the next Strive episodes on the Readyverse, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.